Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for this virtual event. My name is Anastasia, and I'm the events manager for both Bank Square Books in Mystic, Connecticut, and Savoy Bookshop and Cafe in Wellesley, Rhode Island. And tonight's event is in partnership with the Read of the Day Book Club with the New London Day. We have only done one of these events in person, as you may remember, for those of you from the area, with Luann Rice in February, and then the COVID-19 crisis happened. We've had to postpone so many events, but we're really happy to be here with Kenneth Rosen of the new book Bulletproof Vest, and Julia Bergman, the military reporter for the day. So what we're going to do is Julia and Ken are going to talk a little bit for about 30 minutes, and then we will open it up to audience Q&A. Thank you guys so much. Oh, and you'll be able to buy the book through banksquarebooks.com. I'm going to post a link after the event is over, and Ken will be hosting, he'll be doing some, book plates so you can get a signed copy. All right, thanks guys, and I'll leave it to Julia and Ken.
All right, thanks Anastasia, and thanks to Bank Square Books as well, the day's partner in the Read of the Day Book Club. So I'm obviously joined virtually by Ken Rosen. Ken is a senior editor and correspondent at Newsweek based in Italy. He received the Bayeux Calvados Normandy Award for War Correspondence in 2018 and was a finalist in 2018 for his reporting from Syria and Iraq. He's also a two-time finalist for the Livingston Award in International Reporting. So thanks, Ken, for joining me virtually. Glad we can make this happen.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This is going to be fun.
We both joked yesterday when we did a test Zoom that we actually prefer the virtual event because we can't see how many people are out there or what your reaction is. So we're both a little bit more at ease.
And we're both in sweatpants. So
exactly, yeah, on the bottom anyways. So I wanted to start by having you read an excerpt from the book. The book is obviously about a bulletproof vest that you purchased before you went to Iraq to report for the New York Times. And throughout the book, you talk about different scenarios in which you envision the vest actually wouldn't protect you. So wanted to know if wanted you to start with one of those excerpts.
Yeah, so this is a chapter about midway through the book, and the book alternates between personal narrative and sort of research-based history on bulletproofing. In this particular chapter, I have an encounter with one of my fixers. Fixers are a support team who schedules interviews and translates and interprets and does a lot of the legwork for foreign correspondents in different nations. So this is about halfway through the chapter after we've been in the car for a while, and we had an encounter that made me a little bit nervous and worried. I had just landed in Baghdad and was nervous about this man who I had never met before, a sort of referral who I had trusted when we first met, but no longer. So I'll start here. I dart up to my room and use the key he has given me, and I lock the door behind me. I put the door jammer in place and breathe a bit easier, but then I think of the possibility that he copied the key and now has access and can come and grab the money he wants and knows I have brought with me to pay him at the end after our job is done. I tried earlier to tell him I was scared, not of him, but scared of the way I was when I approached the hostile environment instructors in Maryland during my training course years before, as confidants in a dark place, not as a sign of lacking confidence in their or his ability to protect us. When I did tell him I was scared, he became defensive, and I found my fear had no place in conversation, which is why I was sitting on my bed, staring at the ceiling, listening for footsteps in the stairwell, realizing that fear, though reduced to the use of devices such as the GPS locator beacon, bulletproof equipment, and communities, whether real or digital, is an emotion better left checked but unspoken. PPE, this bulletproof equipment, I knew, rarely protects against things as heinous as human intention. The gear is designed only to defend against objects, not people. My gear is fundamentally useless in the practical streetwise situations for which I am supposedly trained or believe myself prepared. Bulletproof material is only so flexible as to allow fewer thoughts of worry to permeate one's deliberations. Bulletproofing does not protect against backstabbers or fixers and translators who may sell you out to the highest bidder. Bulletproofing is in fact impersonal and rigid, reserved only for the indifference of a bullet.
Thank you. So yeah, I wanted to kind of ask you how the protective value of the vest sort of changed for you over time. When you actually first purchased the vest, at the end of the conversation with the salesman, he kind of mentions, it seems like offhandedly, oh, by the way, this vest is not bulletproof. It's bullet resistant. So how did your kind of, perception of the vest change over time?
Well, I initially thought it was necessary, right? It was sort of a prerequisite to reporting from Iraq or Syria or any one of these conflict zones across the globe. So I bought it thinking that I'd be using it a lot, or that in order to get to these places, you actually needed to be wearing one. But I was proven wrong time and again. There were very few situations where you actually need it, though many people travel with it as sort of a backup. And when the salesman told me that it was actually bullet resistant, I think I understood what he was meaning, but I had always put more weight in the protective powers of a bulletproof vest. We see police, we see military, we see it in movies, we see it in fiction, the sort of unending stopping power of Kevlar or bulletproof vest, and don't really think about the levels of bulletproofing, that they're only designed to stop one type of ammunition or two types of ammunition, and only maybe one round or two. You know, they're not indefensible.
And like you mentioned, you actually rarely wore the vest, but you thought about it all the time, as you indicate in the book. And can you talk a little bit, was it a conscious decision not to wear the vest? And in what situations did you actually find yourself wearing it?
Yeah, so it started out being a conscious decision not to wear it because I didn't want to parachute, as it were, into a foreign country that I'd never been to, into a war zone that people had been reporting on for you and me for most of our adult lives, right? And then just pretend like I knew what I was doing. So I wanted to put it aside and show more of a newbie approach to the situation than one that's wholly certain about what I needed to do or where I needed to be or what I needed to wear. And then as I returned to Iraq and Syria more frequently over the last 4 or 5 years, I followed the suit of everyone else, whether they were wearing it or not. Whether you were on the front line was usually the only time you really wore it, but it was difficult to determine when you were on the front line just because of the way ISIS was. Some of the tactics of ISIS were not so cut and dry, and a lot of the times it was just a cumbersome thing to have on you. You know, they're heavy, they're hot, and I just didn't always feel like they were appropriate. Mostly because when you're interviewing civilians and you have this thing on, it has this distancing power. Like, you know, you're trying to protect yourself, but also, you know, get something from them. And I feel like it was a weird trade-off to not be as exposed as they were. Of course, you know, I had to bring their story back to the country, so maybe there was a need for me to be protected. But I always felt that I was maybe not condescending, but indifferent to their plight, to not have them in some form of protective gear.
Yeah, there's a part in the book where you're talking about, you're going to interview residents, they're rebuilding after an attack, and you kind of talk about how uncomfortable you feel that you're wearing this vest when clearly they feel safe enough to sort of be out in the open rebuilding. Can you kind of expound upon that a little bit?
Yeah, I don't even think that it was, and I mentioned that in the book, but I don't think it was also that they were safe, right? I mean, that they just didn't have the necessary protective equipment that I did, and I was coming in and being like, "Oh, do you feel safe? You know, isn't it great that ISIS has been, this place has been liberated from ISIS? Check out my bulletproof vest. You know, I'm still worried about it, but I'm going to see whether or not you are." And they didn't have the privilege. They didn't have the fixers or the convoys or the bulletproofing or you know, the GPS tracker that I mentioned in the excerpt that I did. So they were sort of stuck in a situation that was a raw deal, and they had to make the best of it. And I was stepping into that, you know, holy privilege.
And can you talk about some of those stories, like the one you just referenced that you did tell while you were in the Middle East? You know, what were some of your assignments? What were some of the stories that you were seeking out while you were there?
I first went to Iraq to cover the Battle for Mosul in 2017, and I went to write a story for the Atavist magazine about what Iraqi forces were doing with the bodies of dead ISIS fighters. And that story was well received and had given me the opportunity to go back for other magazines to cover the Kurdish referendum for independence, and later that year in 2017. And then I went back for the election season in 2018 when they were picking a new prime minister in Baghdad. And then, of course, the final days of ISIS in Syria and Baghouz. I went back for Wired magazine just to cover sort of the bookends of this historic time in the global conflicts.
Do you have any plans to go back?
I don't have any plans right now. I'd like to, but I mentioned in the book I'm a new father, and it's just not right now a priority. Not one that I can square away with my home life, but I'm looking for the opportunity.
And backing up a little bit, this book is obviously part of a series about the hidden lives of ordinary objects. And how did you kind of decide that you wanted to focus on the Bulletproof Vest, and this is something you wanted to write about more in depth?
Yeah, the Object Lesson series is from Bloomsbury Academic, edited by two really great guys who pick about 6 every 6 months to publish, and they range from snake to hotel to lighter. Cigarette lighter to, I think they have one that came out as Oceans, and they just give writers the space, writers, journalists, academics, the space to really delve into any object. It could, as I mentioned, all these different types of everyday objects and things you wouldn't think about, the histories, the uses that you might not have considered. And Bulletproof Vest just seemed like an obvious choice just because it was something I had fought with over and over for so many years. I lugged this thing thousands and thousands of miles, and bought 2 pairs, and one was concealable and one wasn't, and supposed to protect me and bring me home, but I rarely used it, and it was a fraught purchase and one I wanted to reconcile. So I think the book gave me the space to do that, and they're really short. There's about 80 in the collection now, or series now, and they're about 30,000 words each. Great little dives, especially for everyone in quarantine. You get a quick little bite of the proverbial apple and sink your teeth into something really interesting. Actually, there's a bunch here on the back, that are coming out later this year. There's magnet, bird, high heel. I mean, there's just so many. Hashtag. There's a whole book on hashtags.
I saw one about refrigerators, phone booths. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really cool. It's really cool.
So I have to ask, do you still have the vest? And if so, where do you keep it?
Yeah, I have both vests and the rifle plates. They're back in Italy now. I'm coming to you live, as you know, from Massachusetts, but they're in my writing shed in Italy. And collecting dust, I think my father-in-law gets the biggest kick out of them. He had the Cat of Yeti come and showed them that his son-in-law has these vests that he uses for his work, and it hasn't ever seen anything like that. So he gets more use out of it than I do these days.
It's almost like they're on display at a museum or something like that. It's like an exhibit of.
Yeah, he goes in, he wipes off the media patch and
yeah. And can you did a lot of research, obviously, for this book on the history of body armor, and you also told the story, which I found really fascinating, of actually a female research scientist who discovered Kevlar, which of course was first used in tires and then later in the Bulletproof Vest. I know you don't want to probably give too much away, but can you talk a little bit about her story and also what stuck out to you from that research?
Yeah, Stephanie Kwolek, who you're referring to, was a scientist at DuPont. What is it? Better Life Through Science, I think, was their tagline or motto. And she had been working on figuring out a new compound for tires to save on gas mileage for cars during a gas shortage in the country. And I was looking for something with a really great tensile strength and low wearability, and came across the synthetic polymer compound, later known as Kevlar, but took her 1,800 or so different renditions of mixing and matching to get to this one thing. But then when she finally did, she went to test it, and her colleague wouldn't test it and pushed back, and she fought for many days and weeks trying to get them to test the tensile strength of it and to see if it would be have the ability to be woven into the fabric that we know now as Kevlar. And came across it. It ended up being this, this impenetrable thing when stacked and pressed together over many different layers, very thin layers. And now, as I mentioned in the book, it's used in everything from windsurfing sails to cooking gloves and Motorola Razrs telephones, bulletproof vests, of course. And it's really just, it's a protective gear. It gives the sense of protection in situations where you might need it or want it, or even if it's not gunfire.
And I also want to ask you, in addition to purchasing this vest, you went through a training before you went overseas to be a war correspondent. You also solicited and received a lot of advice from journalists and others, and wondering if there was a piece of advice that you found most valuable for your safety, either mentally or for your physical protection.
I think just keeping busy. I think I mentioned in an earlier chapter, and it was an excerpt from an essay I published a few years ago, that the downtime is always the toughest for someone like me who's pretty anxious and nervous and doesn't necessarily like interviewing people. The downtime was tough. So to fill that time, I think an editor told me the best advice I got was no matter what happens throughout the day, always go home and transcribe your notes, even if you're tired, even if you're hungry. Just take all your notes and transcribe them, whether it be recorded or written, and get them all down. And that was, twofold. There's two reasons for that. Was to, one, make sure you could read your notes in the morning if you're a terrible scribbler like I am. But two, just to eat up all that extra time so you're not in your head, when you're back at the hotel room, like this instance I described earlier from the excerpt I read. So you're not freaking out about something you might have seen earlier, or, it helps you digest the day in another way. You get to recount the day's events and go through it more methodically and logically and with less emotion.
And obviously you talked a lot about, the vest not making you feel safe, even though obviously you always kept it close by. Were there things that did make you feel safe? Or maybe that's not a luxury that's afforded to war correspondents.
Well, I had really great editors who would be available to me when I needed, and I could call and talk to them for a few hours or however long I needed. I could always reach my wife or my parents. I think the shawarma overseas is really good, and eating that was always my go-to. In Syria, the sweets are super delicious, so I just gained a lot of weight when I could stack up on treats in my hotel room.
Yeah, I was impressed by your ability to do, I think it was push-ups and jumping jacks while also simultaneously eating pieces of beef shawarma, I think it was.
Well, because it's guilt, right? Like you want to take care of yourself.
And then you got to, do the calories. And given your career path, can you talk about how that maybe has influenced or changed your perception or notion of safety, both just personally and generally?
Yeah, there's a lot of people in the beginning of this journey for me, and still today, warn me about being reckless and cautious and the dangers of reporting from these foreign countries. Often told about stories where you take one wrong turn and the rest of your week is not ideal, less than safe. So my perception on safety has changed insofar as I realize that there's only so much I can do, and I can do the best I can and write the risk assessments and get my whole communication plan down and have all the insurance measures in place, have all the bulletproofing equipment up to date, make sure my phone and satellite phone works, and that I trust my fixers and my team and do my research ahead of time to the places I'm going and who's there. But at the end of the day, life steps in, and we can only guard against it so much. And I think our current crisis is probably the most obvious touchstone to this. You can do everything you can. You can wash your hands. You can stay inside. You can not travel. You can work remotely, but you're only so safe. We still have to interact with the world. We still have to go about our days, and there's risks we take every day. And I guess the risk tolerance for each individual varies, but the notion of safety is built into a lot of things that we take for granted. And I think the more conscientious we are about the measures we're taking to be safe and the measures that are in place for us to be safe, then we can, double down on those and make sure that we're more conscious of what we're doing and how we're going about things.
Yeah, and you call the vest your PPE, personal protective equipment, which is obviously now a phrase that we're all pretty well aware of given the coronavirus pandemic. And I saw you tweeted recently, which you kind of just referenced just now, about these face masks and hand sanitizers that people are purchasing, sort of illustrating our desire to forge ahead in times of uncertainty, which I think is a theme of the book as well. So if you could sort of expound on that a little bit more.
Yeah, I think there's just, we have these things in place. We have the TSA, this notion of security when we fly. We have, the face masks. We have these gloves. We have stay-at-home orders. It's all these pointers and advice and guidance is what the CDC calls it. This guidance to keep us safe, so that we can move forward. People are frustrated now that we're stuck at home or that we're, out of work, and a lot of people are sick. Many people have died, and many people are in dire straits. But these measures and these guidelines and the PPE helps us move forward. It's a far-reaching approach to a better life than what we're living through now. And to disregard like these PPE and these measures in place and these guidelines would be to flout the sort of safety precautions that allow us to live longer. So the bulletproof vest and the gloves allow us to approach things that would otherwise be scary, right? I mean, we wouldn't go for groceries if we thought that we would be inhaling these droplets of this virus, but we have something that allows us to go out and be fearless and not worry about situations that could potentially kill us.
And you also talk about in the book how Hollywood kind of props up these false notions of people being invincible, and you kind of go through all these scenes of movies about like these kind of, when you read it, it's kind of ridiculous that people survive these, like actions, I guess. If you could talk a little bit about that as well.
Yeah, I touched on it a little bit earlier, just this, I think you are well aware too, of being a military reporter, that these vests are not that, safe. There's a very small window that's protecting your vital organs, and the rest is pretty penetrable. But they're not foolproof. They don't keep you safe from everything. And the best protection that anyone can get is distance. Ironically enough, in our current situation, distance is what they're prescribing. And earth, right? Like a tree or a mound of dirt will stop a bullet much better than maybe a bulletproof vest would. When I went to the DuPont factory to report on a story for Wired, he had said that one of the technicians there had said, you can build a factory filled with pillows and it'll stop a bullet. It'll just take a lot longer, right? So the relativity of what's bulletproof is a little silly, and the Hollywood depictions prove that point. I think I had one instance of Back to the Future where he uses like a stove top, right, to protect him.
Cast iron, maybe. Yeah.
Cast iron. I don't know how well that would have really worked.
And since it is an anxious time for a lot of people, I was wondering if there are strategies that you had or learned for sort of coping with anxiety and fear that you found sort of helpful for you.
Keeping busy. I mean, right now, just before we got on this call, I was baking a cake.
What kind of cake?
As a gâteau breton, it's just a sort of egg and sugar.
Okay.
Egg and sugar cake.
All the important things.
All the important things. The only things you need. Keeping busy, keeping well fed. Putzing around, never sitting still. I think people get into their heads, or I get into my head a lot, and that only comes when there's downtime and when I'm sort of lounging. And if I can do menial tasks, if I can hang a picture or build a desk, put together a desk. People are ordering a lot of things on Amazon. Cook something, bake something. Then I find that I'm able to cope with anything that's coming around me. But for situations where you can't exercise, right, in the hotel rooms that I described, jumping jacks and jump rope and keeping active, and all else fails, over-the-counter sleeping meds always works.
Right. And so you're based in Italy. You're here in the States now, but you're based in Italy, and you were there when the coronavirus outbreak started there. So can you talk about that, and can you talk about your plans to return to Italy and what you want to report on when you get back?
Yeah, we were there when the outbreak started in Lombardy, which was the region next to our own, and I say our, meaning my family and I. And we sort of noticed the trend of it growing and more infectious cases, or more cases being confirmed. And we're worried about them shutting us down in our own village. And so I wanted to get us safely to the States. And we got here thinking that we would be sort of protected. I'm going to get out of the sun. Protected because knowing what was happening in Europe, we hoped that there would be measures and things in place here to keep that from happening. But then we got stuck in another lockdown, and looks like things have been improving over there I think more than 20,000 people have died in our region. We live with 70-year-olds, my aunt-in-law and my father-in-law, who are at risk and are being told to just keep them safe and stay inside. So I think we'll go back when it's a little bit quieter, when some of the restrictions are lifted. They lifted restrictions on children's bookstores and nurseries for plants and things like that. So they're slowly rolling out of the lockdown that they've been in for more than 2 months. And when I get back, I'm hoping to do some writing on the antibody work that the government is doing to assess whether or not someone is fit to be traveling around and interacting with other people.
And I imagine you're still in touch with people from Italy. And so what are they kind of saying about what life is like there right now? I
have a story coming out this weekend in Newsweek just about the feelings of damnation. The economy's in total ruin. The country has been in a recession since 2008. It never really crawled out of it. Jobs are being lost day in and day out. And the mafia started to step in to sort of fill a lot of the government roles of handing out groceries and supplemental services. So there's fear and worry that there's going to be more, or there will be more violence and disruption. I think a lot of people looked at Italy and Spain and saw all the singing and celebration of the medical workers and the emergency service personnel, and then did it here in the States. But while they're still doing it here in the States, they've stopped doing that in Italy. And there's no more singing. There's no more chanting and playing music on the balconies. There's desperation, and people want to get back to work, but aren't sure how.
And I think I have read that people are required to have essentially papers on them when they go out to sort of provide, if they're stopped by police, to provide sort of explanation of why they're sort of out and about. Or
yeah, you requires a form that you have to fill out and sign to state that you are aware of the fines and penalties that you can incur if you break the law or the quarantine needlessly, i.e., visiting a friend rather than going for work. And people are being fined. People are being told to just stay in. And viral videos aside, it's very serious. And the military came and visited a lot of my family to give them masks and say, just stay put. There's no reason to move about. And luckily, our village really didn't fall into the same category as Lombardy. We didn't have as many deaths or cases reported there. And I think that was a lot to do with us seeing it sooner than later.
And I'm going to ask a few more questions, then we're going to open it up to all of you. If you guys are on Zoom, there's at the bottom of your screen, there should be a Q&A tab that you can submit questions, and you can also submit them on the Facebook. Wanted to see if you have any other books planned.
Yeah, I have a book coming out in January of next year about, it's a narrative nonfiction book, which chronicles the lives of 5 students who went to tough love treatment programs and what became of them many years later. That'll be out January 5th from Little A. And maybe we'll see each other again for that.
Yeah, there we go. We can do this all again, hopefully in person this time.
Yeah.
And so I think for people who maybe are interested in getting into sort of book writing or becoming authors, do you have any advice? And did the publisher reach out to you, or did you pitch the idea to them?
Yeah, the series is in partnership with The Atlantic. So there's a website that you can go to and pitch your own idea. And then there's a whole process as far as writing a book proposal goes, but they select, X amount of people to write a book proposal and then let you know many, many months down the line. As far as advice for people wanting to get in writing, I wouldn't recommend it. It's a terrible racket.
Me either.
Yeah, don't do it. There's no job security. It's brutal. Criticism is abounding, abounds everywhere. And it's better just to keep your mouth shut and enjoy your life privately rather than publicly. But in all honesty, if all jokes aside, I think if someone wanted to write and publish books, I think the best advice I could give is just to do it, to write as much as you can, to find avenues to publish, to reach out to your local papers and magazines and regional affiliated magazines and publications to see what opportunities they have for up and coming writers, or front of book, what we call front of book stories, small little news items or arts and entertainment features, and just keep knocking at the door until it comes down. I think it's mostly a numbers game.
So we do have a question from somebody tuning in. This is from Lori Robichaud. She wants to know how you originally got into journalism and sort of what was your original impetus and early training.
Early training, I worked at two very small local papers, one in Juneau, Alaska, and one in Savannah, Georgia. I was the editor-in-chief of my school paper, and got these jobs having been the editor, and worked my way up through reporting ranks. I'm just doing local coverage, breaking news stuff, arts and entertainment features, and had written about the Occupy Wall Street movement for the local paper, and I got the front page for that story. It was really exciting, and seeing my name in print was just addictive, and I sort of went on from there, and went from writing 450 word stories to 10,000 word stories to 25,000 word stories, and now to 30,000 word books, and the next year 85,000 word books. So a slow progression over 10 years or so.
Yeah. And can you talk about the different dynamic from, writing a book like this versus a magazine piece or doing reporting like you did in the Middle East?
The difference between a book and a magazine piece, I think the writing is inherently the same, right? It's a different structure. You have more space and latitude to be creative, but the process is really just seat time, sitting down and setting goals, daily goals, weekly goals, and figuring out how you want the narrative to play out, and then writing daily to meet that goal. I was really fortunate enough to have several organizations back me financially, and with residencies where I was able to spend a month or 2 months just sitting in a room writing with no worries, no financial obligations, just cracking away at it. And time, I can't stress enough, is really beneficial to projects like this.
You probably had much more time, I guess, for the book than you did maybe with the deadline of writing a piece for Newsweek or some sort of other publication like that.
Well, yeah, I was writing this one and the one that's coming out next year at the same time. So it was very, very hectic, and I don't recommend having 2 books under contract at once. Definitely not recommended. But this one I wrote in about 2 weeks or 3 weeks.
Wow.
And just plowed through and set a goal. And it was nicer to have the piece come out, in print as a book form, just because so much of my writing is digital nowadays. Unlike, you get your stuff in the paper every day, I imagine, or every other day or so. And I miss that. I get a lot of website features, or maybe once every now and then I'll get into a print magazine, but it's tough going out there.
So we have another submitted question. This is from Rachel Fine. She says, thanks for taking the time to speak today. She was wondering, what was one of the most surprising things you learned while researching and writing the book?
Well, thanks for the question. The most surprising thing I learned, I think the most surprising thing I learned was how far back the history of bulletproofing and protective gear goes. Generally speaking, whoever they are, societies across the globe for centuries have been developing cotton extracts or metal-plated chainmail to protect against each other, essentially against person-on-person violence. And that the idea of bulletproofing dates back as far as the late 1800s. To me, that was remarkable, just insofar as my understanding of bulletproofing being something that's relatively modern. And I guess on the spectrum of on the scale of the timeline, it is modern. But I figured Kevlar was more or less the latest and greatest. But in fact, it had been silk much longer, much before that. So that was the most surprising thing. Thanks for the question, though.
What would you say, like, your baseline knowledge was of bulletproofing or kind of protection and protective gear was before you sort of embarked on this, or even before you purchased the vest?
Yeah, that's a good question. Do you know the levels of bulletproofing? I mean, you read the book, but did you know before?
No, absolutely not. And honestly,
Right.
I had to read that part over and over again because, I'm not very familiar with the different,
Right. I remember before I purchased it, I was trying to figure out what do I need to protect against, and I had to look around to learn that I needed to protect against like a 5.56 or a 7.06 round from an AK-47 or assault rifle, and the level of protection you need to stop just one or two of those was very high. So I always thought there was sort of like this baseline or this just generalized bulletproofing that stopped most things. But in fact, there's very minimal requirements for 9mm. There's more requirements for the heavier 5.56, and then the ceramic plates that I have in mine, plus the Kevlar that I have in the vest itself, should stop something on the higher range, more powerful range of riflery or rifles than most. But I think what I got was overkill. So I had no idea that there was like this range, and I had to research what I was necessarily needing to protect against before purchasing the vest that I did.
And you mentioned on the vest, I guess everyone put their blood type, and like, who told you to do that? And I think you mentioned in the book that it actually like wouldn't have actually been that helpful.
I'm a very pessimistic person. And, I didn't know that if I were to lose blood in a combat situation, that my blood type would be of benefit to the group of militias or foreign forces that I was traveling with, non-state actors I was traveling with. But generally speaking, the training course that I took, a hostile environment first aid training course, suggested that you always put your blood type on your vest in case of, evac and blood transfusion needs if you made it to a hospital. In my situation, though, I don't think I would have made it to a hospital every time. I think some of the situations I was in, it would have been nearly impossible. But it had been beneficial to some friends that I knew, just, for the medics' own edification. And I guess some people put other things. People put their tourniquets on their bulletproof vests. People put their med kits on their bulletproof vests. They have the moly stripping that you can sort of attach anything. I put my pens in there.
And we have another submitted question. It's from Lori Robichaud again. She says, there seems to be a lot less emphasis on international reporting than there once was across all platforms. What drew you to being a war correspondent, and what do you see as the state of foreign journalism in America today?
It's a good series of questions. I think if you're referring to American media, it's inherently always been very insular and inward looking. American publications don't necessarily take interest in foreign affairs. It doesn't pertain directly to American interests. Of course, there's exceptions with the Journal and the Times and the Post, all these wonderful publications who are doing really important work from countries across the globe. But there's less emphasis now because there's less funding. There's less training for journalists like myself, freelance journalists who are trying to go overseas and bring back these stories to American readers. It's not cheap, and it's very expensive, and it's very dangerous. And oftentimes writers are getting paid $250 a story that they spent 2 days on and, paid a fixer for and got shot at, and the story disappears the next day. And it's a tough line of work. There used to be more avenues to it. There used to be more opportunities for young journalists to get into wire reporting for the Associated Press or Reuters or AFP or places like that. But more and more journalists are going freelance and living abroad and trying to make their way back to the States. So I think the state of international journalism is robust. It's just fragile, and there are people who need support in order to bring these stories back. And that's why part of the proceeds from the book are going to go to a nonprofit that provides emergency medical training to journalists working in conflict zones, whether it be Syria, Iraq, Yemen, South America, Latin America, all these other places that see conflict, Ukraine, and RISK offers this program to teach people how to treat wounds and health for mental health, sort of what Julia and I have been talking about to combat anxiety and worry and fear. And then at the end of the session, they're also given a first aid kit, which is paramount to the treatment of usually colleagues or yourself. So people reporting in conflict zones, reporters reporting in conflict zones have their own first aid kit with them that they use to work on themselves, and then someone else who carries their own that is specifically meant to be used on them. So everyone has their own life-saving apparatus.
And you found, I was trying to look through my notes to find the name of the group, but you found this group also when you were reporting overseas, right? It was kind of like a group for freelance journalists that was kind of helpful. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Right, the Frontline Freelance
That was
Registry.
it.
It's based out of London and is a group of freelance journalists who, share insight, share support. It's a network of people working in these conflict zones and overseas. They adhere to guidelines that they hope all publications who hire freelance journalists to adhere to, which are, making sure that they're safe and follow strict risk assessment guidelines. Not every publication now will take the chance on a freelance journalist and send them overseas just because the liability is too high. But there are still a lot of journalists out there doing really incredible work from a freelance basis, and they need a lot of help.
This is kind of like an insider baseball question, but I guess who are some of the war correspondents that you really looked up to, or whose reporting you really admire, would you say?
Anthony Shadid, Dexter Filkins, Luke Mogelson, a lot of people who gave me a lot of advice going into it. I don't know how you go about reporting, but I go about reporting asking more or less the same series of questions to a lot of people until I start to see a pattern, and then sort of sit back and say, okay, I think I've got a general understanding or taken a temperature of the situation that I can write about it. So I did the same with trying to figure out how to report overseas, and reached out to a lot of people. And then when I started to hear the same thing over and over again, or in different ways, I said, okay, I think I'm ready to go. And some of them were, who I mentioned earlier, they really helped me out and guided me in the process.
Got it. So we have another submitted question from Lori.
Lori,
she's coming for my job. No, I'm just kidding. She says she doesn't want to dominate the questions, but she's asking great questions. But she wants to know about the fixers. Can you talk a little bit about, reporting in a foreign country and using these fixers when you don't know the language of the people you're interviewing? How does that relationship work with your fixers, and how do you find them?
Good. Yeah, good question. So the Frontline Freelance Register was a group of journalists working in these conflict zones, or is a group working in these conflict zones. And there's also a group on Facebook where we all connect and share tips and advice on reaching out to people who are working as fixers in these countries. And generally they're local reporters or researchers based in that country who have lived there all their lives and are willing to help you navigate the country. It's difficult when you don't speak the language. Of course, there's a lot of barriers from sort of the intention of what you say to how it's translated and whether or not your questions are being translated directly. So trusting your fixer and knowing your fixer is paramount to the success of any story and any trip. But it's disorienting, to enter a country and not speak the language and then be directly interacting with strangers who only speak this language, and you're trying to learn all the customs and not overstep your bounds. And I crossed my legs once or twice in front of, a higher official in Iraq, and that was a terrible thing to do, or, it was very looked down upon. And there's these things that you just wouldn't know until the situation arises, that the fixers are there to help you with, or navigate for you, these by proxy, these lifesavers, really.
And in some cases, it kind of felt, it seemed like a feeling too, and sort of about the relationship, right? Because I know there was, early on in the book, you referenced kind of this fixer that you don't feel comfortable with, and you switch and you go with another fixer. Can you talk about that as well?
Yeah, the gut feeling. I think just with anything in life, if there's a worry in the gut, a tumble in the gut, don't adhere to it, and don't do what you might be planning on doing. And in that situation, there was. I was new. It was my first trip and my first fixer, and I was gonna stay with him and his driver. Otherwise, we travel in groups, so it's me, a photographer, a driver, and a fixer. And generally, the driver and the fixer both speak several languages, the regional languages. In this case, Kurdish and Arabic. There's two dialects of Kurdish, and they were just goofing off and being disrespectful to the photographer, and I was assuming that this was just how things went in, the foreign reporting zone in a conflict zone, and I didn't want to overstep my bounds and discipline people in a way that I felt out of place or not appropriate in doing, or in any number of weird social situations. But thank God the photographer I was with was someone who was well versed in conflict zones and war reporting, and she'd lived in Yemen for 3 years and was really something of a fixer to me in helping me through these situations. And she had she looked at me and said this was bad juju the way they were acting, and I wasn't feeling comfortable as well, so we just ended up hightailing it out of there and switching fixes the next day.
And you did end up picking up some Arabic, is that correct? And can you talk about sort of learning that language?
A little bit. I mean, I don't remember much of it now. A lot of it was similar to my Hebrew that I learned growing up. But it's nice to know a few phrases and to understand what is being said to your fixer, so you're not totally just passively sitting there. I always try to be an active listener, so to know a few words and a few phrases was always beneficial to sort of track where the conversation was going, or chime in on my own, or introduce myself at least, or say goodbye, or say thank you, or any sort of well wishes, and be aware of the religious holidays that were happening, and state holidays and national holidays, just so I wouldn't seem so out of place.
And I have one last question. It's kind of a little off topic, but have you ever thought about writing fiction?
I've thought about it. I won't ever do it. What about you? Would you write fiction? Would you write?
I don't think so. Yeah.
I don't know.
I guess it'd be a good escapism, huh?
I mean, I don't know. I'll probably get a lot of crap for this, but I don't know how much different it'll be. I mean, do I have to change my sentence structure in order for it to be fiction, or can I just write nonfiction and then call it fiction, right?
I think it's up to you, right?
All right, so then I'll just write nonfiction.
Yeah.
And then if I don't sell it, I'll label it a novel.
You'll label it with fiction. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Awesome, guys. Thank you so much for both taking time out of your probably very busy schedules right now in quarantine to come talk with us. And thank you to everyone who tuned in and to those who asked questions. It was really great to sort of see some participation here. Again, you can order Ken's book through us at banksquarebooks.com. If you register through Eventbrite, I'll send you a link. Thank you guys for tuning in, and thank you, Ken and Julia, for coming and talking. That was so interesting and very timely.